A little beggar girl burst into a millionaire's wedding, shouting, "Don't marry her. She's not who you think." Days later, he uncovered a chilling secret about his bride. The late afternoon sun streamed through the floor-to-ceiling windows, casting warm golden light onto the spacious living room. Adam adjusted the crisp collar of his shirt for what felt like the 10th time, his hands trembling slightly. He glanced at the clock on the ornate mantelpiece, its soft chime echoing in the quiet house. "She'll be here soon," he muttered, more to himself than anyone else. Nancy sat cross-legged on the plush rug near the sofa, her fingers idly tracing patterns in the fabric. At 11 years old, she was small for her age, with wide brown eyes that held the quiet attentiveness of someone who'd learned to observe before speaking. She glanced at her father, catching the nervous tap of his foot against the polished hardwood floor. "You really like her, don't you?" Nancy's voice was soft, but there was a hint of wariness in her tone. Adam turned, his expression brightening. "I do, sweetheart. She's special. You'll see." He crouched down to Nancy's level, placing a hand on her shoulder. "This is a chance for us, for our family. Victoria is kind and understanding. She'll make things feel whole again. Don't you want that?" Nancy hesitated, biting her lip. The idea of whole sounded nice, but she couldn't quite shake the feeling that something was slipping away, something she couldn't name. Still, she nodded. "I guess." The sound of tires crunching gravel outside snapped Adam to his feet. "She's here." His voice was tinged with both excitement and apprehension as he smoothed his shirt one last time and strode to the door. Nancy remained on the rug, her chest tightening as she heard the front door open, her father's cheerful greeting filling the entryway. A moment later, a woman's voice floated in, melodic and warm, yet carrying a sharpness beneath it, like the faint edge of a blade hidden in velvet. "Adam, this place is lovely," the woman said. "And that view, it's like something out of a storybook." Nancy shifted uneasily as her father led Victoria into the room. She was beautiful, in a way that seemed too perfect, her blonde hair falling in soft waves around her shoulders, her pale pink dress flowing with an effortless grace. Even her smile, dazzling and symmetrical, felt rehearsed. "This must be Nancy," Victoria said, her voice honeyed as she crouched to Nancy's level. Her hands, adorned with rings that caught the fading sunlight, reached out as if to brush Nancy's hair, but stopped just short, hovering awkwardly. "Hello," Nancy murmured, unsure how to respond. Victoria's eyes, piercing blue, lingered a fraction too long before she straightened, her smile widening. "She's lovely, Adam," Victoria said, turning back to him. "You must be so proud." Adam's face lit up, his early attention melting away. "She is. Nancy's everything to me." Nancy's gaze darted between the two of them, unease settling in her stomach. There was something overly polished about Victoria, like a mirror too clean, reflecting too brightly. She watched the way Victoria's hand rested on her father's arm, fingers curling possessively, her nails pressing slightly into his sleeve. "Why don't we sit down?" Adam suggested, gesturing toward the sofa. "I'll get some tea." "That would be wonderful," Victoria said, releasing his arm with a graceful nod. As Adam left the room, Victoria's smile remained fixed, but the warmth seemed to drain from her expression. Nancy shifted uncomfortably as Victoria turned her attention back to her. The woman's gaze now felt calculating, like she was appraising something rather than admiring it. "You're like having me around, Nancy," Victoria said, her tone dropping to something quieter, sharper. She leaned closer, her voice just above a whisper. "But don't make things difficult for your father. He doesn't need more stress, does he?" Nancy froze, her fingers tightening around the edge of the rug. Victoria's words hung in the air, icy and unmistakably cruel despite the soft delivery. Before Nancy could respond, or even process what she'd heard, Victoria leaned back, her smile reappearing as if it had never left. Adam returned with a tray, his expression hopeful as he handed Victoria a cup of tea. "I hope you like Earl Grey." Victoria accepted it with a radiant smile. "Perfect, Adam. Just perfect." She glanced at Nancy, her eyes flickering briefly with something unreadable before turning back to him. Nancy sat silently, her mind racing. She wanted to speak, to tell her father that something was off, but the words wouldn't come. The room felt colder somehow, despite the golden light of the setting sun. But Nancy couldn't shake the memory of Victoria's whispered words or the faint press of her nails into her father's arm. Something was wrong, and Nancy could feel it deep in her bones. The morning sunlight filtered through the lace curtains of the dining room, casting delicate patterns across the polished oak table. Victoria sat at the head of the table, a cup of steaming coffee in one hand and a magazine in the other. She looked up, her smile impeccably pleasant as Adam entered, adjusting his tie. "Good morning, darling," Victoria said, setting the magazine aside. Her tone was warm, almost saccharine. "You're looking dashing today. Important meeting." Adam chuckled, his cheeks coloring slightly. "Just another day at the office. But thank you, Victoria." He leaned in to kiss her cheek, then glanced toward the kitchen. "Where's Nancy? She should be down by now." Victoria's smile flickered just for a moment before returning in full force. "I told her to tidy her room before breakfast. She's been so forgetful about her chores lately. Don't you think it's time she learned a little discipline?" Adam hesitated. "She's just a child. I don't want her to feel neglected." Victoria interrupted smoothly, placing her hand over his. Her rings caught the sunlight, glittering like sharp-edged promises. "Adam, I adore Nancy. She's such a bright girl. But she needs structure and a sense of responsibility. I thought we agreed this was important for her growth." Adam sighed, his shoulders slumping. "You're right. I just don't want her to think I'm being too strict," Victoria finished, tilting her head sympathetically. "Darling, trust me. She'll thank you for this one day." Upstairs, Nancy stood frozen at the top of the staircase. She had been about to descend, but stopped when she heard Victoria's voice. It wasn't the words themselves, but the tone, calculated, polished, and far too confident. Clutching the railing, she waited until Victoria's footsteps echoed away before tiptoeing down to the dining room. Breakfast was cold by the time Nancy sat down. A slice of dry toast and a small cup of milk sat in front of her, in stark contrast to the elaborate spread Victoria had prepared for Adam. Victoria returned, carrying a small plate of pastries, which she set in front of him with a practiced smile. "Nancy," Victoria said, her voice light but firm, "what did I tell you about being on time for meals?" "I'm sorry," Nancy mumbled, lowering her gaze. "Sorry doesn't fix bad habits," Victoria replied, her tone soft, but with an edge that pricked. "Let's make a new rule. Breakfast is served at 7 sharp. If you're late, you don't eat." Adam looked up, startled. "Victoria, that's a bit harsh." "Consistency is key, Adam," Victoria interrupted, with a gentle laugh. "It's how we teach children accountability, don't you agree?" Caught between the two, Adam hesitated, then nodded. "Maybe you're right. Nancy, you'll need to be more mindful, okay?" Nancy's chest tightened, but she nodded silently. A growing knot of resentment and sadness replaced her appetite as she picked at the toast. As weeks passed, Victoria's influence over the household became undeniable. Small changes, like a new schedule for chores or a revised bedtime, soon snowballed into a strict regime. Nancy's complaints were met with dismissive reassurances or outright scolding. Adam, eager to keep the peace, often sided with Victoria though his eyes occasionally betrayed a flicker of guilt. Nancy spent more time in her room, where even the comforting familiarity of her books felt stifled under Victoria's ever-watchful eye. Meals became smaller, and Victoria's sharp critiques, veiled as guidance, left Nancy feeling as if the walls of the house were closing in. One evening, as Nancy wandered toward the kitchen for a glass of water, she stopped short. Victoria was there, her back turned, her movements deliberate and precise. Nancy peeked around the corner, holding her breath. Victoria was pouring something from a small vial into Adam's pill organizer. The liquid glistened briefly before disappearing into the capsules. Victoria hummed softly to herself, her movements unnervingly calm, as if she had done this 100 times before. Nancy's pulse quickened. She wanted to scream, to run to her father and tell him what she had seen. But her feet wouldn't move, rooted in fear and disbelief. Victoria closed the vial and slid it into her pocket, then turned, her expression serene. Nancy dove back into the shadows, her heart pounding. Later that night, as Nancy lay in bed, the memory replayed in her mind like a broken record. She thought of her father's tired eyes and slow steps, which had worsened over the past few weeks. She thought of Victoria's smile, too perfect, too polished. But when she imagined telling her father, all she could see was the doubt in his face, the inevitable dismissal. Victoria had woven herself too tightly into their lives, and Nancy's words would be no match for her calculated charm. She curled up tighter under her blanket, wishing for the courage to act, even as the weight of helplessness pressed her deeper into silence. The days fell into a rhythm, Victoria's presence casting a shadow over the house that grew heavier with each passing week. Adam, unaware of the strings being pulled around him, continued to trust Victoria implicitly. Her demeanor was flawless, warm, attentive, and always seemingly in control. Each morning began with Victoria preparing breakfast. She would hum softly as she brewed coffee, her movements deliberate and precise. Hidden among her graceful actions, however, was the delicate tilt of a vial, the faint drip of a colorless liquid disappearing into Adam's cup. She stirred with measured care, the sound of the spoon clinking against the porcelain unnervingly steady. "Adam, your coffee," she said one morning, sliding the cup toward him as he scanned the newspaper. Her smile, bright and practiced, masked the satisfaction flickering in her eyes. "Thank you, darling," Adam replied, taking a sip. "It's perfect, as always." Across the table, Nancy watched intently, her gaze shifting between Victoria's expression and her father's unwitting consumption. Her chest tightened as she noticed the subtle but growing changes in him. The way he rubbed his temples more often, the lethargy in his movements, and the shadow of discomfort that passed over his face before he forced a reassuring smile. "Are you feeling okay, Dad?" Nancy asked cautiously. Adam looked up, startled. "Oh, just a bit tired. Nothing to worry about, sweetheart." Victoria placed a hand on his arm, her touch light but commanding. "You've been working too hard, Adam," she said, with a gentle laugh. "I keep telling him he needs to rest, Nancy. Don't you agree?" Nancy's jaw tightened. There it was again, the way Victoria's words seemed to coil around the conversation, redirecting it away from her father's discomfort and back to her perceived devotion. Over the following weeks, Adam's symptoms worsened. He complained of headaches and bouts of dizziness that left him gripping the edge of the counter for support. Victoria, ever attentive, adjusted her narrative to match the progression of her plan. "You're pushing yourself too much," she said one evening as she guided him to the sofa. "Let me take care of everything. Just focus on getting better." Nancy, lingering in the doorway, clenched her fists. She had begun keeping a closer eye on Victoria, sneaking glimpses into the kitchen when she thought no one was watching. One morning, She caught sight of the vial, small, glass and inconspicuous, tucked into Victoria's pocket. It confirmed what her instincts had been screaming all along. Victoria was hurting her father. The turning point came one quiet afternoon. Nancy, determined to intervene, reached for Adam's coffee cup before he could drink it. "Dad, maybe you shouldn't—" Before she could finish, Victoria appeared, her steps silent as a predator's. Her hand shot out, snatching the cup from Nancy's grasp. "What on earth are you doing?" Victoria's voice was sharp, though still wrapped in its deceptive silkiness. "I just thought it might be too hot," Nancy stammered, her voice faltering under Victoria's piercing glare. "Nonsense," Victoria replied, her tone softening as she turned to Adam. "She's been acting so strangely lately. I think all the changes have been hard on her." She placed the cup in front of him, her smile reappearing as if nothing had happened. "Drink up, darling." Adam hesitated. His gaze flickered between the two of them. Finally he sighed and took a sip, clearly uncomfortable, but unwilling to question Victoria's judgment. Nancy's heart sank as she watched her father place the cup back on the table, his trust in Victoria unshaken. That night, as Nancy lay in bed, the weight of her failure pressed down on her. Victoria's grip on the household felt unbreakable, her influence on Adam absolute. The memory of Victoria's sharp tone replayed in Nancy's mind, a reminder of the consequences of standing against her. Downstairs, Victoria sat at the dining table, the dim light casting long shadows across her face. She twisted the vial between her fingers, its contents dwindling. Adam's health was deteriorating steadily, and she knew it was time to increase the dosage. "Almost there," she murmured to herself, a flicker of satisfaction crossing her lips. Her plan was falling into place, one carefully calculated step at a time. As Adam grew weaker, his dependence on Victoria deepened. He leaned on her, both physically and emotionally, unaware of the slow poison that coursed through his veins. Victoria's image as the devoted wife solidified in his eyes, even as Nancy watched helplessly from the sidelines, her suspicions mounting, but her voice silenced. The house felt colder and emptier, despite the same sunlight streaming through the windows. Adam sat slumped in his favorite armchair, a blanket draped over his lap. His face was pale, the dark circles under his eyes deepening with every passing day. Victoria stood by the window, her phone in hand, scrolling through financial reports she had obtained from Adam's office. Her lips tightened as she read the numbers. The company's profits had plummeted, debts piling up faster than Adam had let on. Her fingers tapped against the window pane, the rhythmic sound betraying her frustration. She glanced over at Adam, who was too weak to notice her scowl. "Darling," she called, her voice dripping with false concern. "You never mentioned how much pressure the business has been under. Why didn't you tell me?" Adam stirred, his movements sluggish. "It's nothing I can't handle," he said weakly. "Just a rough patch." Victoria's smile was tight, barely masking her disdain. "Of course you're right," she said, crossing the room to sit beside him. She adjusted the blanket on his lap, her touch light, but calculated. "But you shouldn't worry about these things now. Your health is more important." Adam nodded faintly, his head sinking back against the chair. Victoria watched him for a moment, her mind racing. The assets weren't what she had anticipated. If she was going to salvage anything, she needed to act quickly. That evening, Victoria sat at the dining table, flipping through a small leather notebook filled with figures and notes she had taken over the past few weeks. Selling the company outright might be her best chance to secure whatever funds remained. She had already begun making subtle suggestions to Adam, framing them as ways to lighten his burden. "You've done so much for this company," she had told him just days ago, her hand resting gently on his. Maybe it's time to let someone else take over, so you can focus on getting better." Adam had looked at her with tired eyes, his trust in her unshaken. "You might be right," he murmured. "But it's not that simple." Victoria's impatience flared again as she recalled the conversation. Not that simple. She would make it simple. Adam, meanwhile, began to notice the cracks in his world. His head throbbed constantly, and every step felt like wading through quicksand. He could barely keep his balance, his vision blurring at the edges. His once sharp mind felt dulled, the numbers on his reports swimming before his eyes. And yet, somewhere in the fog of his thoughts, a memory surfaced. Nancy's voice, trembling yet insistent. "Dad, maybe you shouldn't drink that." He had dismissed her, believing her to be acting out of childish jealousy or confusion. But now, her words lingered, sharp and accusatory. Adam's gaze drifted to Victoria, who stood by the kitchen counter preparing his tea. Her movements were as graceful as ever, her hum soft and soothing. But there was something unnerving about the precision of her actions and the careful way she measured each ingredient. Doubt began to creep into his mind, slow and insidious. "Adam, are you all right?" Victoria's voice broke through his thoughts, her tone as sweet as ever. He blinked, forcing a smile. "Just tired," he said. "You've been saying that a lot," she replied, setting the tea in front of him. "You really should rest more. Let me take care of everything." Her words felt heavier now, as if they carried a weight he couldn't quite decipher. He hesitated before lifting the cup to his lips, his hand trembling slightly. Victoria's eyes flicked to his hand, and for a brief moment, her mask slipped, a flash of impatience, almost annoyance, before she quickly replaced it with a concerned smile. The next morning, Adam collapsed in the study. The thud echoed through the house, sending Nancy racing down the hall. She found him sprawled on the floor, his breaths shallow and labored. "Dad!" she cried, kneeling beside him. "Dad, wake up!" Victoria appeared moments later, her face a picture of practiced shock. "Oh my goodness, what happened?" she exclaimed, rushing to his side. But Nancy saw it, the slight delay in her reaction, the calculated way she glanced at the scene before kneeling down. "We need to call an ambulance," Nancy yelled, her voice trembling. Victoria hesitated, then nodded. Of course," she said, pulling out her phone. But her eyes lingered on Adam for just a second too long, as if weighing the outcome. Nancy sat by his bedside, clutching his hand as tears streamed down her face. He opened his eyes briefly, his gaze meeting hers. "I'm sorry," he whispered, his voice barely audible. "You tried to warn me." Nancy shook her head, her sobs choking her words. "It's not your fault, Dad. I should have done more. But his eyes fluttered closed, and the steady beeping of the monitor flatlined. Nancy screamed, her grief echoing through the sterile hospital room. Adam passed away that night, his frail body finally succumbing to the poison that had been eroding him from within. Victoria stood outside, the night air cool against her skin. She pulled her coat tighter, a small smirk playing at her lips. Inside, Nancy's cries faded into the distance. The plan had worked, but she felt no satisfaction, only impatience to finalize the next steps. "Almost done," she murmured, glancing at her watch. It was time to move on. The morning after Adam's funeral dawned grey and unwelcoming. The air was thick with the promise of rain, and the world outside the sprawling estate seemed indifferent to the grief within. Nancy sat on the edge of her bed, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. Her eyes were swollen from days of crying, her mind a blur of anguish and confusion. Victoria appeared at the doorway, her silhouette sharp and unyielding against the dim light of the hall. "Nancy," she said, her voice cool and businesslike, "come downstairs. We need to talk." Nancy hesitated before following, her small frame trembling as she descended the grand staircase. The house, once warm and alive with her father's presence, now felt foreign and hostile. Victoria's footsteps echoed ahead of her, precise and deliberate, leading her into the living room. Victoria gestured for Nancy to sit, but remained standing herself, looming over the girl like a judge about to deliver a verdict. "Nancy," she began, her tone clipped and devoid of sympathy. "Your father's passing has left many things unsettled. I've taken on the responsibility of handling the estate, but unfortunately, the situation is far worse than I anticipated." Nancy's heart sinks. She wanted to argue, to demand answers, but the weight of her grief left her silent. "I simply can't manage everything," Victoria continued, her lips curving into a faint, calculated smile. "And I'm afraid that includes you. You're old enough now to take care of yourself." The words hit Nancy like a physical blow. She stared up at Victoria, her mind struggling to comprehend. "What do you mean?" she whispered. Victoria's smile tightened. "It means you'll have to leave, Nancy. This is no longer your home." The car ride was silent, save for the steady hum of the engine. Victoria drove with an unsettling calm, her gaze fixed on the road ahead. Nancy sat stiffly in the passenger seat, clutching a small bag of hastily packed belongings. The city skyline loomed closer with every passing mile, the buildings casting long shadows as the morning light struggled to break through the clouds. "Are you worried about Nancy's future? It would be great to know where these emotional people come from. Leave your hometown name in the comments and we'll get back to the story." When the car finally stopped, Nancy looked out the window and felt her stomach drop. They were in a part of the city she didn't recognize. Grimy streets lined with crumbling buildings, graffiti scrawled across every available surface. The air smelled of garbage and faintly of something burning. Victoria leaned over and opened the door. "This is where we part ways," she said, her tone as indifferent as if she were commenting on the weather. Nancy turned to her, panic rising in her chest. "You can't just leave me here," she cried, her voice cracking. Victoria's expression didn't falter. "You'll manage," she said coldly. "You're a smart girl. Besides, I have other things to deal with." With that, she reached over and shoved Nancy's bag out onto the sidewalk. Nancy climbed out of the car, her legs trembling as she stood on the uneven pavement. "Please," she begged, tears streaming down her face. "Don't do this." But Victoria didn't respond. She pulled the car door shut and drove away without a second glance, leaving Nancy standing alone in the middle of the unfamiliar street. The days that followed were a blur of fear and desperation. Nancy wandered aimlessly, clutching her bag like a lifeline. The streets were alive with noise, honking cars, shouting voices, and the occasional bark of a stray dog. People passed her without a second look, their faces hardened and indifferent. The cold crept in as the sun dipped lower, casting long shadows over the city. Hunger gnawed at Nancy's stomach, and her throat was dry from crying. She sat down on a cracked bench, her small hands clutching her knees as she tried to make sense of her new reality. Her mind flashed to her father, his warm smile and reassuring words. She could almost hear his voice telling her to be brave, to never give up. The memory sparked something within her, a flicker of determination. She wiped her tears with the back of her hand and stood, her legs shaky but resolute. By nightfall, Nancy had found a small alcove near a run-down convenience store to take shelter. She rummaged through her bag, pulling out a granola bar she had packed in haste. It was stale, but she ate it anyway, the taste barely registering as she focused on the sounds around her. Footsteps, distant laughter, the occasional siren. She didn't sleep. The ground was cold and hard, and fear kept her wide awake. But as she stared up at the faint stars peeking through the city's haze, she made a silent vow. She would survive. She would expose Victoria for what she had done, no matter how long it took. In the next months, as Nancy scavenged through a trash bin behind a diner, a sleek black car caught her eye. Her breath hitched as she recognized it. Victoria's car. It was parked just across the street, its polished surface gleaming even in the dull light. Nancy ducked behind the bin, her heart racing. She peered out cautiously, her gaze fixed on the car. For the first time since her father's death, hope ignited in her chest. Victoria was here in the city, and if Nancy could find her, maybe, just maybe, she could find a way to stop her. Finally, the opportunity to expose Victoria came on that fateful day. While rummaging through the trash for food, Nancy discovered a crumpled newspaper with the headline on the front page, "The Marriage of Victoria Blake to Dennis Warburton." The name Dennis rang familiar, one of the wealthiest businessmen in the city. Victoria had not only moved on, but had set her sights on a new victim. "This is it," Nancy whispered to herself, her voice barely audible over the distant hum of traffic. Her hands trembled as she gripped the edge of her tattered coat. She won't get away this time. The Warburton estate was ablaze with light, the sprawling lawn transformed into a vision of elegance. Rows of white chairs lined the garden, and guests in glamorous attire moved between the canopied reception areas, their laughter ringing out in the crisp evening air. A string quartet played softly near the grand staircase that led to the arched altar. Inside the mansion, Victoria stood before a gilded mirror, adjusting the lace sleeves of her wedding gown. Her reflection smiled back, cold and calculating. Beside her, a woman with dark eyes and a sharp voice, her confidant and accomplice, whispered urgently. "Dennis's lawyer is cautious," the woman said. "He insisted on a prenuptial agreement. Have you handled it?" Victoria turned slowly, her expression unreadable. "Of course. He's far too smitten to enforce anything binding. But just in case." She reached into her jewelry box, retrieving a small vial. The liquid inside caught the light, glimmering faintly. "We have other ways." The woman hesitated, her eyes darting toward the door. "You're sure about this?" Victoria's lips curled into a smile that didn't reach her eyes. "I never leave things to chance." Nancy lingered at the edge of the estate, her stomach twisting as she watched the ceremony preparations. She was dirty and gaunt, a stark contrast to the finely dressed attendees who laughed and mingled under the golden glow of the chandeliers spilling out from the mansion windows. Her fingers tightened around the frayed strap of her bag. She had no plan, no allies, and no proof. But she had her voice, and tonight she would use it. The ceremony began as the sun dipped below the horizon and the garden bathed in the soft glow of hanging lanterns. Victoria glided down the aisle, her every step measured and deliberate. The guests murmured in admiration, oblivious to the venom behind her polished smile. Dennis stood at the altar, his face lit with a mixture of pride and adoration. To him, Victoria was perfection, poised, loving, and endlessly charming. He had no idea what lay beneath. The officiant began to speak, his voice steady and ceremonial. Victoria's gaze flicked briefly toward the crowd, scanning for any sign of disruption. Satisfied, she returned her focus to Dennis, her smile widening. And then a voice shattered the calm. "Stop!" Nancy's cry rang out, raw and desperate, cutting through the melodic cadence of the officiant's words. Heads turned in unison as Nancy stumbled forward, her disheveled appearance drawing gasps from the crowd. Her hair clung to her face, and her clothes hung loosely on her small frame, stained and torn from her months of survival on the streets. But her eyes blazed with a fierce determination. "You can't marry her," Nancy shouted, her voice trembling but resolute. "She's a liar, a murderer." Gasps rippled through the audience as whispers erupted like wildfire. Victoria's face froze for a fraction of a second before she recovered, her expression softening into one of concern. "Who is this child?" Victoria asked, her voice steady, tinged with pity. She stepped toward Nancy, extending a hand as if to comfort her. "Someone help her. She's clearly unwell." Nancy jerked back, glaring at her stepmother. "You poisoned my father," she accused, her voice breaking. "You killed him. And now you're going to do the same to him." She pointed a trembling finger at Dennis, who frowned in confusion. Victoria's mask didn't falter. She shook her head sadly, addressing the guests. "This poor girl is the daughter of my late husband," she said, her tone measured and sympathetic. "She's been through so much. Losing her father. It's been hard on her. She's confused." "I'm not confused," Nancy screamed, her voice cracking. "You're lying. She's lying to all of you." Dennis stepped forward, his brow furrowed. "Victoria, what's going on?" he asked, his voice low but firm. Victoria turned to him, her eyes shining with what seemed to be unshed tears. "Dennis, please," she said softly. "This is exactly why I didn't want to mention her. She's troubled. I've tried to help her, but she's been inconsolable." Nancy shook her head violently, her fists clenched at her sides. "She's lying," she repeated, but her words felt thin against Victoria's composed demeanor. The guests began murmuring again, their attention shifting to the bride, whose calmness only added to her credibility. Dennis's jaw tightened, his gaze shifting between Victoria and Nancy. Finally, he gestured to the security guards stationed near the entrance. "Please, remove her," he said, his voice strained. "No!" Nancy screamed as two guards approached. She thrashed against their grip, her cries echoing across the garden. "You have to believe me. She's going to hurt you too." As the guards dragged her toward the gate, Victoria stood silently at the altar, her expression a mixture of sadness and relief. Her hands tightened around her bouquet, her nails pressing into the delicate stems. Behind her composed facade, her mind raced. Nancy was alive, and worse, she was willing to fight. Outside the estate, Nancy collapsed onto the cold pavement, tears streaming down her face. Her voice was hoarse from shouting, her body trembling with rage and exhaustion. But even as despair threatened to consume her, she clenched her fists, her resolve hardening. The Warburton estate was quiet now, the night's drama reduced to a murmur among the lingering guests. Dennis sat in his study, the faint glow of a single lamp illuminating his face. A glass of bourbon sat untouched on the table beside him. He stared at the floor, replaying the scene from earlier. The desperation in Nancy's voice, the raw conviction in her accusations. Victoria had dismissed it all with grace, her calm demeanor soothing the restless murmurs of the crowd. But the image of Nancy's tear-streaked face lingered, and Dennis couldn't shake the unease creeping into his mind. "She's a liar, a murderer," Nancy's words echoed, sharp and cutting. Could it really just be grief? Or was there something more to her story? The following days brought little reprieve. Victoria, now his wife, carried on as if nothing had happened. She was poised and attentive, always anticipating Dennis's needs. Yet there were cracks in her facade that Dennis began to notice. At breakfast, Victoria's laughter rang a beat too loud when he joked about the wedding drama. Her explanations about Nancy's troubled state were rehearsed, her phrasing too perfect. Dennis found himself watching her more closely, noting the subtle impatience in her movements when she thought no one was looking. One evening, Dennis approached her as she sorted through a stack of old documents in his office. She glanced up, her expression softening into a smile. "Darling," she said, sliding the papers into a folder. "What brings you in here? I thought you'd be in the garden." Dennis hesitated, studying her. "Just wanted to see what you were up to." "Nothing exciting," she replied lightly. "Some estate paperwork. There's so much to sort through after the wedding." She kissed his cheek and brushed past him, the faint scent of her perfume lingering in the air. Dennis waited until she was out of earshot before pulling the folder from the desk. Inside were letters and financial documents, his own records, some dating back years. His chest tightened. Why was she digging into his past? The unease grew unbearable. Late at night, Dennis began to investigate on his own, poring over every detail he could find about Victoria's past. The initial search was fruitless. Her history appeared spotless. But as he delved deeper, inconsistencies began to surface. A previous marriage certificate was hastily annulled, a suspiciously large insurance payout following the death of another husband. The dates didn't add up, and the pattern was too glaring to ignore. Dennis stared at the document spread before him, his mind racing. Each piece of evidence added weight to Nancy's accusations. He thought of Victoria's controlled expressions, her perfect answers. It all fit too neatly. Meanwhile, Nancy struggled to survive on the city's unforgiving streets. Her stomach growled constantly, and her thin frame grew weaker by the day. She scavenged what she could, discarded sandwiches, leftover coffee in paper cups. The nights were the hardest, the cold biting at her through her worn clothes. But even in her darkest moments, Nancy clung to hope. She replayed the wedding in her mind, searching for ways she could have been more convincing. If Dennis had even the slightest doubt about Victoria, maybe she had planted a seed. "Don't give up," she whispered to herself, her voice hoarse. "You can't let her win." Dennis's suspicions solidified one afternoon when he stumbled upon a death certificate for Victoria's second husband. The cause of death: poisoning. He leaned back in his chair, his pulse pounding in his ears. The signs were there, hidden in plain sight. Her pattern was unmistakable. She married wealthy men, gained control of their finances, and left a trail of destruction in her wake. He thought of Nancy again, her eyes wide with desperation. She had been right all along. That evening, as Victoria prepared dinner, Dennis sat at the table, his mind racing. He watched her carefully, noting the practiced way she moved and the slight tension in her jaw as she chopped vegetables. "Dennis, you've been so quiet today," she said, her tone light. "Is everything all right?" He forced a smile. "Just tired, that's all." Her eyes lingered on him for a moment, searching, before she returned to her task. Dennis's heart pounded. He needed a plan. Victoria was dangerous, and he had to protect himself and Nancy. As night fell, Dennis locked his study door and spread the evidence across his desk. The connections were undeniable now. Victoria's charming veneer hid something far darker. The memory of Adam's death, Nancy's pleas, and Victoria's unsettling calm at the wedding burned in his mind. He picked up the phone and dialed his lawyer. "I need you to look into something," he said, his voice steady despite the storm of emotions inside him. "It's urgent." Dennis sat in his office, the faint hum of his desk lamp the only sound in the room. The files sprawled before him confirmed everything Nancy had screamed at the wedding. Victoria's past was a web of deception, each thread connecting her to the deaths of her previous husbands and the wealth she'd siphoned away after their demise. He leaned back, his mind working methodically despite the storm of emotions threatening to overwhelm him. Confronting Victoria directly would be too dangerous. She was a master manipulator, and he had no intention of playing into her hands. Instead, he would play along, pretend to be the smitten, trusting husband she thought he was, and set a trap to expose her. The following day, Dennis feigned normalcy, his behavior careful and calculated. Victoria, ever poised, seemed none the wiser. She busied herself with finalizing plans for their honeymoon, her demeanor warm and affectionate. As she arranged dinner reservations and spa treatments, her thoughts strayed to the small vial hidden in her travel bag. The poison was subtle, tasteless, just enough to make Dennis appear sick, vulnerable, and dependent on her. From there, she could manage the rest. Her lips curled into a faint smile as she envisioned the months ahead. "Is everything ready for the trip?" Dennis asked as he entered the room, his tone light and unassuming. "Of course, darling," Victoria replied, her voice a melody of reassurance. "I've made sure it will be unforgettable." "I don't doubt it," Dennis said, flashing her a smile. Inside, his heart hammered. Every word he spoke to her felt like a lie, a dangerous game he couldn't afford to lose. That evening, as Victoria packed, Dennis made a phone call. His head of security, a man he trusted implicitly, answered on the first ring. "Find Nancy," Dennis said firmly. "Bring her here. I don't care what it takes." "Understood, Mr. Warburton," the man replied, his tone leaving no room for doubt. Meanwhile, Nancy huddled in a shadowed corner of the city, her body worn and frail. The sudden approach of two men in suits startled her. Her first instinct was to run, but the older man raised his hands in a gesture of peace. "Miss Nancy," he said gently, "Mr. Warburton sent us. He wants to help you." Nancy hesitated, her mind racing. Could she trust them? Then she remembered Dennis's face at the wedding, conflicted, unsure. Maybe her words had reached him after all. Slowly she nodded and allowed the men to lead her to the waiting car. Back at the estate, Nancy was ushered into Dennis's study. She stood awkwardly near the door, her thin frame wrapped in a borrowed coat. Dennis looked up from his desk, his expression softening at the sight of her. "Nancy," he said quietly, gesturing for her to sit. "I owe you an apology." Her eyes narrowed, distrust flickering across her face. "You didn't believe me." "I didn't," Dennis admitted, his voice heavy with regret. "But I do now. You were right about everything." Nancy hesitated, studying him. There was no deceit in his eyes, only exhaustion and determination. Slowly she sat down. "What are you going to do?" she asked. Dennis's jaw tightened. "I have a plan, but I need you to trust me." For the first time in months, Nancy felt a glimmer of hope. She nodded. The honeymoon destination was a secluded, luxurious resort nestled in the mountains. Victoria marveled at the opulence as they checked into their suite, her mask firmly in place. The plan was simple. Wait until dinner, slip the poison into Dennis's champagne, and let nature take its course. She had done it before, and she would do it again. At dinner, the waiter poured 2 glasses of champagne, the bubbles rising delicately in the crystal flutes. Victoria's heart raced, but her movements were steady as she reached into her bag, her fingers brushing the vial. She uncapped it with practiced ease and tipped a few drops into one of the glasses, while Dennis looked away. "To us," Victoria said, raising the poisoned glass. Dennis smiled, his expression unreadable as he clinked his glass against hers. "To us." As Victoria sipped her champagne, a strange taste lingered on her tongue, metallic and bitter. She frowned slightly, but dismissed it. It was only moments later, as the room began to tilt and her vision blurred, that she realized something was wrong. Her glass slipped from her hand, shattering on the floor as she clutched the edge of the table. Dennis leaned back in his chair, watching her with cold detachment. "Feeling unwell, darling?" he asked, his voice calm. Victoria's eyes widened in horror as the realization struck. You switched them," she gasped, her words slurring. Dennis stood, his gaze steely. "Did you really think I wouldn't figure it out?" Victoria lay on the marble floor of the honeymoon suite, her breaths shallow and labored. The once perfect facade of control had shattered, leaving her vulnerable and exposed. Dennis stood over her, his expression unreadable as he dialed his security team. "Bring the authorities," he said into the phone, his voice cold. "I want every piece of evidence secured before they arrive." He knelt beside Victoria, his gaze steady. "You've hurt too many people, Victoria. This ends tonight." The emergency medical team arrived quickly, rushing Victoria to the nearest hospital. The poison coursing through her system left her hovering between life and death. Doctors worked frantically to stabilize her, unaware of the tangled web of deceit she had woven. Dennis remained in the suite and oversaw the search that his private investigators were conducting. Victoria's luggage and belongings were laid out on the dining table, revealing an assortment of incriminating items. The poison vial, several forged documents, and, most damning of all, a leather-bound notebook filled with meticulous notes about her schemes. Each page detailed her previous marriages, the fraudulent insurance claims, and the deaths of her past husbands. Dennis flipped through the notebook, his stomach twisting with every entry. It wasn't just about the money. Victoria seemed to relish the power she held over her victims, documenting their suffering with a detached precision that chilled him. News of the incident spread quickly. Within hours, Victoria's name was plastered across every major news outlet. Headlines screamed about the Black Widow of the elite, detailing her string of marriages, mysterious deaths, and financial scams. The media frenzy exposed her as a con artist of unparalleled cunning, and the public quickly turned against her. For Nancy, the news was both a relief and a painful reminder of what she had lost. Sitting in the warmth of Dennis's estate, she watched the coverage on a flat-screen television. Her thin frame was wrapped in a blanket, a cup of tea trembling in her hands. "She can't hurt anyone anymore," Dennis said gently, sitting beside her. Nancy nodded, her voice barely a whisper. "But it doesn't bring my father back." Dennis placed a reassuring hand on her shoulder. "No, it doesn't. But we'll make sure she pays for what she's done, and we'll make sure you're safe." As the investigation unfolded, more of Victoria's past came to light. Police uncovered bank accounts in multiple aliases, documents showing her involvement in fraudulent business dealings, and even connections to several unexplained deaths. The case against her was airtight, and prosecutors began preparing for what was expected to be one of the most high-profile trials in recent history. But Victoria's condition remained critical. She was placed under heavy guard in the hospital, her body weakened by the poison she had intended for Dennis. Doctors worked tirelessly to keep her alive, knowing she was their key to unraveling a network of crimes that spanned decades. For Nancy, life at the Warburton estate was an adjustment. The safety and comfort were a stark contrast to the harsh reality of the streets she had endured for months. Though she was grateful for Dennis's kindness, she struggled to trust him completely. Her nights were plagued with nightmares of Victoria's cold, calculating smile and her father's anguished final moments. One evening, as she sat on the estate's balcony, Dennis joined her, carrying 2 cups of hot chocolate. He handed one to her without a word and leaned against the railing. "You've been through more than anyone should ever have to," he said after a long silence. "I can't erase what's happened, but I want to help you rebuild." Nancy looked at him, her eyes filled with a mixture of gratitude and uncertainty. "I don't know how to move on," she admitted. "Every time I close my eyes, I see her. I hear her lies. I feel broken." Dennis's voice was steady. "You're not broken, Nancy. You're stronger than you think. You stood up to her when no one else could. And because of you, she's finally been stopped." Her lips trembled as she clutched the mug tighter. "I just want to feel safe again." "You will," Dennis promised. "It'll take time, but you'll get there, and I'll be here every step of the way." As Victoria remained in critical care, the authorities closed in on the remnants of her schemes. Her notebook provided a roadmap to uncovering her accomplices, shell companies, and hidden assets. Each revelation solidified the narrative of a woman who had used charm and manipulation as weapons, leaving a trail of ruined lives in her wake. In the end, the poison Victoria had prepared for Dennis became her undoing. Though she survived, her health was irreparably damaged, leaving her too weak to mount any defense. Her trial loomed on the horizon, a final reckoning for the years of destruction she had wrought. For Dennis and Nancy, the nightmare was beginning to lift. The faint beeping of machines filled the sterile hospital room as Victoria stirred awake. Her body was frail, her limbs weak and unresponsive. She tried to sit up, but the effort left her gasping. Panic flooded her as she took in the tubes and monitors tethered to her, her mind racing to piece together what had happened. Memories came in fragments: the champagne, the bitter taste, Dennis's cold gaze. Her chest tightened as the realization settled in. Her plan had failed. She had been outplayed, and now everything was gone. Her breathing grew shallow, her anger boiling beneath her fragile exterior. "Nancy," she hissed through clenched teeth, her voice barely audible. Her hatred for the girl who had disrupted her perfect scheme burned like fire. She would make Nancy pay, no matter what it took. Victoria ignored the pain that was shooting through her body as she pulled at the wires that were holding her. Alarms blared as she stumbled out of the bed, her legs buckling beneath her. Her determination kept her moving, every step dragging her closer to the door. She managed to slip out of the hospital unnoticed, adrenaline masking the agony of her movements. Her mind focused on one thought: revenge. She would find Nancy and destroy her, no matter the cost. Meanwhile, Nancy's life began to take shape again under Dennis's care. She attended therapy sessions, gradually working through the grief and trauma Victoria had inflicted. Dennis enrolled her in school, ensuring she had the tools to rebuild her future. The walls of his estate, once cold and intimidating, became a sanctuary for her healing. One evening, Nancy sat in the garden, her face tilted toward the setting sun. She still carried scars, but her tentativeness and softness were returning. Dennis watched from a distance, feeling a deep sense of purpose he hadn't experienced in years. He had failed to protect Adam, but he wouldn't fail Nancy. "You seem happier," he said, joining her on the bench. Nancy nodded, a small smile playing on her lips. "It's getting easier." Slowly. She looked at him, her expression earnest. "Thank you for believing me, for giving me a chance." Dennis placed a hand on her shoulder. "You gave me more than I gave you, Nancy. You reminded me that doing the right thing is never easy, but it's worth it." Victoria's escape was short-lived. Limping through the city, her weakened body betrayed her. The edges of her vision blurred as exhaustion and pain overtook her. She stumbled into a busy street, her thoughts clouded with hatred and desperation. Her vision blurred, her chest heaving with each labored breath. The last thing she saw was the blinding glare of headlights before a car struck her, sending her body hurtling through the air like a broken doll. She landed on the wet pavement with a sickening thud, blood pooling beneath her as rain mixed with the crimson. The world around her faded, the sounds of the city dimming until there was nothing. News of Victoria's death spread quickly. The Black Widow, who had evaded justice for so long, had finally met her end. For many, it felt like poetic justice, a life defined by manipulation and destruction brought to an abrupt and unceremonious close. For Dennis and Nancy, it marked the end of a nightmare. Weeks later, Nancy stood before Adam's grave, the autumn leaves swirling around her. She knelt, placing a bouquet of sunflowers, his favorite, at the base of the headstone. "I did it, Dad," she whispered, her voice steady. "She's gone. She can't hurt anyone else." Tears filled her eyes, but they weren't just from sorrow. For the first time, she felt a sense of peace. She traced the letters of his name with her fingers, a silent promise forming in her heart. "I'll make you proud," she said. "I'll live a life you'd be happy to see. I won't let what happened define me." As she stood, the sun broke through the clouds, casting a warm glow over the cemetery. Nancy turned and walked back toward Dennis, who waited near the gate. Together, they left the past behind and entered a hopeful, resilient future. As time went on, Nancy's past's shadows started to vanish, giving way to a brand new life that was full of hope and purpose. Under Dennis's steadfast care, she blossomed into a confident young woman. The trauma she had endured shaped her, but it did not define her. Instead, she used it as fuel to advocate for others who had suffered at the hands of abusers like Victoria. Nancy founded a non-profit organization dedicated to helping vulnerable children escape dangerous situations and rebuild their lives. She worked tirelessly, giving speeches, organizing fundraisers, and sharing her story with those who needed to hear it most. Her resilience became a beacon of hope, inspiring others to find their own strength. Dennis remained by Nancy's side throughout her journey. He had long since transitioned from a wealthy businessman to a father figure, providing the unconditional love and support Nancy had lost when her father died. Watching Nancy grow and thrive gave him a sense of redemption. He couldn't undo his earlier mistakes, his failure to see Victoria for what she truly was, but he could ensure that Nancy never felt alone again. "You've come so far," Dennis told her one evening as they walked through the park near his estate. The autumn leaves crunched under their feet, the crisp air carrying the scent of earth and change. Nancy smiled up at him, her face radiant with quiet confidence. "I wouldn't have made it without you, Dennis. You gave me a chance when no one else would." Dennis stopped and turned to her, his expression serious. "No, Nancy, you saved yourself. You had every reason to give up, but you didn't. You fought for the truth, even when no one believed you. That's what makes you extraordinary." Her smile softened, and she reached for his hand. "Thank you," she said simply, "for everything." On a bright spring morning, Nancy stood on the balcony of her new office, overlooking a city that had once seemed so frightening and unwelcoming. The view stretched out before her, vibrant and alive, filled with the possibilities of the future. She thought of Adam, and of the lessons he had taught her: kindness, resilience, and the courage to stand up for what was right. Though he was gone, his influence was woven into every choice she made and every step she took. Dennis joined her, carrying 2 steaming mugs of coffee. "Thinking about him?" he asked gently. Nancy nodded, her eyes misty but smiling. "Always," she said. "Everything I do is for him, to make sure his sacrifice wasn't in vain." Dennis placed a hand on her shoulder. "He'd be proud of you, Nancy. I know I am." They stood in silence for a moment, the warmth of the sun on their faces. Nancy's heart swelled with gratitude, for Dennis, for her own strength, and for the chance to turn her pain into something meaningful. She turned to him, her voice firm and filled with resolve. "There's still so much work to do. So many kids out there need someone to fight for them." Dennis smiled. "And you're the perfect person to lead that fight." As the city buzzed with life below, Nancy took a deep breath. She was no longer the scared, broken girl Victoria had tried to destroy. She was a survivor, a fighter, and a voice for those who couldn't speak for themselves. With hope and determination lighting her path, Nancy stepped forward into a future her father would have been proud to see. If this film touches your heart, leave your mark with a like. And don't forget to subscribe to our channel to explore more meaningful stories with us. Share your feelings with us and tell us your own stories. Every word you share is a building block that helps create our strong and enduring community. Together, we'll create a warm space where everyone can share and connect. Finally, don't miss the incredible stories coming your way soon. We're always here to bring you the best selections, full of deep values yet entertaining. See you there.